It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning, just a few days after my wife returned from her overseas mission in Israel. She works in high-level federal security, specifically with firearms operations, but you'd never guess it just by looking. At her, she's calm, respectful, and carries herself with grace until someone crosses the line. And that's exactly what happened when our HOA's self-proclaimed enforcer, Karen, decided to stir up drama that morning. Karen has always had a reputation in our neighborhood for being nosy, confrontational, and quick to call the cops over the smallest things. But this time, she picked the wrong woman on the wrong day. My wife had just gotten home after a 16-hour flight, emotionally drained, still unpacking both bags and memories from a place where life and danger go hand in hand. She just wanted to walk our dog and breathe fresh air. But to Karen, seeing an unfamiliar woman in her neighborhood was apparently a threat worth dialing 911 over. It wasn't long before the flashing lights rolled up. Cops stepped out, hands near their belts, ready for a situation they clearly didn't understand. Karen, standing with arms crossed on her porch, pointed at my wife like she'd caught a criminal. She had no idea that the woman she just accused of suspicious behavior was a decorated federal agent, someone who trains law enforcement on firearm safety and tactical operations. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get more tense, my wife calmly handed over her ID. That's when everything started to shift. The officers looked down, looked at her, and then at each other. What happened next? Well, let's just say Karen didn't see it coming, and honestly, neither did I. What followed turned our quiet neighborhood upside down, made Karen realize this wasn't your typical HOA complaint. The officers stepped back for a second, glancing again at the ID in their hands. My wife didn't flinch. She's used to tense moments, just not ones that happen in our own front yard. Meanwhile, Karen stood there with a smug look, arms still crossed, like she was waiting for applause. She had no clue that the woman she tried to report had just spent the last 6 months embedded with international law enforcement teams, helping to train units in tactical defense and weapons handling. What's wild is that Karen wasn't even subtle. She'd called in the report saying my wife looked foreign and possibly armed. That alone was enough to show her bias. See, Karen doesn't actually know many people in the neighborhood. She just watches everyone from behind her curtains, always finding something to complain about: trash bins out too long, cars parked too close to the curb, or kids being too loud on weekends. But calling the cops, that was new. And this time, it wasn't just annoying, it could have gone sideways fast if my wife hadn't kept her cool. The officers, trying to keep things calm, started asking basic questions. Where was she going? Did she live here? Why didn't they recognize her? My wife answered politely but firmly, clearly letting them know she wasn't intimidated. I could see their body language shifting. They weren't just dealing with a random neighbor now. They were talking to someone who understood procedure better than they did. Still, Karen kept chirping from the sidewalk, tossing out random accusations. She was casing the house. She walked through my grass. At one point, she even claimed my wife was talking into an earpiece. It was ridiculous, but the damage was already done. The situation had escalated, and we were all standing at a crossroads. Except only one of us knew exactly how far this was about to go. By now, few neighbors had started coming out onto their porches, curious about the flashing lights and raised voices. Some of them knew my wife, at least by face, but none of them dared step in. That's the power Karen had built up. Months of tattling, threats of HOA fines, and non-stop emails had people walking on eggshells. And now, here she was, trying to paint my wife as some kind of threat just because she didn't recognize her. The craziest part, my wife was still in her hoodie and travel pants, holding our dog's leash like it was any other day. But Karen saw something else. Maybe it was because my wife looks ethnically ambiguous, or because she wasn't smiling politely as she walked. Maybe Karen just needed a new target to feel powerful again. Either way, the tension kept growing. The officers hadn't told anyone to leave yet, and Karen was feeding off the attention. What she didn't realize was that my wife's presence in this neighborhood wasn't some accident. After returning from Israel, she'd requested low-key reassignment time, and we chose this spot because it was supposed to be quiet. Ironically, she'd been scheduled to speak with local law enforcement later that week for a community training session, one that might now be canceled depending on how this played out. At the same time, another issue was bubbling underneath. A few weeks back, Karen had started complaining about security risks in the neighborhood and even tried pushing a rule to restrict certain types of visitors or deliveries. Most people brushed it off as more HOA noise, but now her paranoia was starting to look like something deeper, something that could push this whole neighborhood into a real crisis if left unchecked. And standing in the middle of it all was my wife, calm but watchful, like she already knew where this was headed. The officers asked my wife to wait while they checked a few things, stepping aside to speak quietly near their patrol car. Karen didn't move. She was still hovering by the sidewalk like she had just saved the neighborhood, talking to one of the newer neighbors in hushed tones and casting glances toward us. My wife stood still, arms relaxed but alert. I could tell she was thinking through every possible outcome, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. The air felt heavier by the minute. Our dog even started pacing, picking up on the tension. I could hear one of the officers mentioning a database check. That's when my wife gave me a quick look. It wasn't panic, it was preparation. It's the kind of look she's used to giving when something serious is about to go down. I knew she was holding back, trying not to make this bigger than it already was. But I also knew she wouldn't let it slide if things turned ugly. Then, a second squad car pulled up. That's when I really felt it. Something had shifted. Whether Karen had said more to dispatch or the initial officers needed backup, I didn't know. But now there were 4 cops on the scene, and the whole street had gone silent except for the sound of radios and footsteps. It no longer felt like a misunderstanding, it felt like an operation. The lead officer stepped forward and asked my wife to confirm her identity again. She did, calmly, and then added, "You might want to call your captain." That line hung in the air like a match over dry leaves. Karen paused. The officers exchanged glances. Nobody spoke. Even the neighbors leaned in closer, eyes wide. That's when the energy completely changed, not just for us, but for the entire block. And none of us knew just how deep this was about to go. The officer hesitated for a second, then stepped back and spoke into his radio. My wife didn't say another word, she just waited. Karen, now visibly annoyed that things weren't going the way she expected, started pressing in. "Why aren't you detaining her?" She was acting suspicious, talking into something, circling houses. Her voice cracked a little, like she was losing grip on the narrative she'd created. Then came the twist none of us saw coming. One of the new officers, the one who had just arrived, glanced at my wife's ID again and stiffened. "Wait a second," he said under his breath, then pulled the lead officer aside. It wasn't long before they both stepped back over, suddenly more formal, more alert. "Ma'am, are you here on official assignment?" the lead officer asked, this time with an entirely different tone. My wife didn't answer directly. She reached into her jacket's low, controlled and handed over a second card. This one wasn't her standard ID. It was her federal task force credential. The officer looked at it, blinked, and suddenly straightened his posture. "Understood," he said quietly, and stepped away again. Karen wasn't having it. What is going on here? What is she showing them? Why won't someone arrest her? She was unraveling fast, no longer calm or collected. Pacing now, like she was the one being watched. But then it got worse for Karen. One of the officers walked over to her, asking if she'd made any statements about the neighborhood or tried to enforce private rules outside of HOA protocol. At first, she stuttered, then doubled down, saying she had every right to monitor threats in her own community. That's when my wife turned slightly and said, "You've been flagged on a neighborhood report for harassment patterns. I've seen your name before." The whole street went still again. Even the officers looked surprised. Karen's face dropped, and her next words came out quieter than before. What? What report? But by then, the situation had turned. And it wasn't just about one morning anymore. It was about everything Karen had done leading up to it. Karen froze. Her eyes darted from the officers to my wife, then back again, like she was trying to piece together what had just been said. "Flagged me," she mumbled. My wife didn't blink. "You've shown up on multiple neighborhood reports filed through a federal community safety initiative. Your complaints follow a pattern targeting new residents, people of color, and anyone you deem out of place. That's what got my attention before I ever stepped foot on this street." The officers looked at each other. One of them nodded, slowly confirming they had access to the same community safety logs. Karen's voice turned defensive fast. "I was just looking out for everyone. I didn't mean anything by it." But it was too late for backpedaling. The data didn't lie. Over a dozen complaints, most tossed aside by the HOA board, had been quietly passed on to a federal oversight team tracking neighborhood bias and misuse of emergency services. That's when the lead officer addressed her directly. "Ma'am, you made a false report, escalated a non-crime, and put someone's safety at risk. We're going to file an incident report, and we may have more questions for you later." Karen went pale. For the first time, she didn't have anything to say. No finger pointing, no power trip. Just silence. My wife stepped forward, not to gloat, but to speak clearly. "I came here to rest. I've spent months in situations where real threats exist. I didn't expect the danger to come from a neighbor with too much time and too little empathy." It was the most personal thing she'd said all day. The officers nodded and thanked her for her cooperation, offering quiet apologies before driving off. Karen, humiliated, stormed back inside without another word. But just as we turned to head home, our neighbor across the street, a quiet man who rarely spoke, called out gently, "I filed one of those reports too. It took me a while to believe. I needed to." That twist hit harder than we expected. Turns out, Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a pattern. And my wife. She didn't just survive, she exposed it. The days that followed were surprisingly calm. Karen kept to herself, her porch lights off and blinds drawn tight. No more HOA emails. No surprise inspections. It was like she'd vanished into the background she used to control. Meanwhile, my wife got an unexpected thank you from the local precinct. Turns out, the officers had taken her words seriously and passed them up the chain. An internal review was launched into how certain neighborhoods had seen repeated misuse of emergency services, especially from residents weaponizing 911 for personal bias. Our neighbors slowly started opening up. The man across the street wasn't the only one. A young couple down the block admitted Karen had once followed their teenage son for wearing a hoodie too late in the evening. An older woman shared how she was fined twice for a potted plant that didn't match community standards. None of them had felt safe enough to speak before. But something shifted after that day. My wife's presence had reminded everyone that silence often protects the wrong people. She went on to give that training session to local law enforcement. This time with a full audience and even a few HOA board members sitting in. Her story became part of the session's opening discussion, not as a warning, but as an example of how easily fear can be disguised as neighborhood concern. We came to this neighborhood looking for peace, but what we found was something better: truth. Sometimes standing your ground doesn't mean raising your voice. It just means knowing who you are and not letting someone else define that for you. And as for Karen, well, she may still be watching, but now she knows. Someone's watching. Back.